Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel, and today we have another Canada federal election forecast update. This time, the budget disaster. Now, with no further ado, before we begin the rest of the video, I'd like to once again shout out all my channel members. You really appreciate all the stuff you guys do for me. It really helps everything go smoothly and make the channel better. So thank you guys. Thanks everything you can do. And if you want to support the channel, by all means, go like, share, subscribe, comment below, or if you feel so inclined, you could go join as a member down below in the description. Let us begin. So, the most big news that has happened in the Canadian politics world, as you would have seen in my last video, last month, April 18th, I think, was that the budget came out. And the budget had all sorts of big things in it, talking a bunch of new spending commitments, a bunch of new taxes, etc., etc. And this was like the Liberal government's last throw of the dice, at least this calendar year, to try to turn things around. Part of Trudeau's, at least according to internal leaks, 3-month plan to try to turn around the polling numbers, try to regain 5 points by July. Some have speculated that actually, come the summer, if the polls aren't getting any better, Trudeau might resign. I don't really put much credence myself into those rumors, but they are rumors that exist. And as always, I love reporting rumors because they're so fun. They're almost always wrong, but they're really fun to talk about. Anyways, I'm not going to go too much detail on the intricacies of whether Trudeau will resign or not. I think he's not going to do it. That's the short end of the story. There's no advantage to the Liberals, in my opinion, for that to happen. But let's talk more about what has actually happened here. The budget. So what is the result of the budget? Well, it'll be easiest to see bringing up this. And now this is a bit of a chaotic spreadsheet here. I know, I apologize. But if we just zoom in for now, specifically just to the last 3 weeks. So as we can see here, prior April 22nd, the last update before the budget was published, or the post-budget polls had come out, the Liberals had, or the Conservatives had flatlined around 41%. They had been there that way for approximately 3 months. And the Liberals were sitting around 28%, where they've been for roughly 3 months. Since the budget, things have moved quite dramatically. Now, the Bloc, the Greens, the People's Party, they're roughly where they are. It's just noise, the differences between them. Other, it's really only up because of one, like, really anomalous poll that had the Conservatives really high, or sorry, other really high in Atlantic Canada, I believe, or was it the Prairies? I don't know. One of the two had the other, like, exceptionally high, so that's probably just more anomaly than anything else. The three main parties are the ones that actually saw a lot of movement here. The NDP lost 0.6%, the Liberals lost 1%, and would you believe it or not, the Conservatives pretty much gained 1.6%. Wow, shocking. It turns out the two parties who essentially agreed on the budget are what lost ground from an unpopular budget. Shocking, right? Because the thing that's really worth noting too about this budget is the Greens didn't like it, the Bloc didn't like it, and the Conservatives didn't like it. So it's not like this is just partisan Conservative discontent. You also have a genuine left-wing party in the Greens opposing it for various reasons. Reasons that are actually very similar to what Singh publicly said, which basically, like, the budget doesn't do enough for X, Y, Z reasons, too much corporate welfare, and then Singh voted for the budget. And then the Bloc is, usually they're a little center-lefty, but they're kind of a weird party, because as a big tent nationalist party, they don't really, strictly speaking, have a good partisan affiliation. Calling them left-right doesn't make too much sense, because there is left-wing and right-wing factions in it. Now, in Canada at large, you could say the Bloc leans left just because, specifically speaking, Quebec is a left-wing province relative to the rest of the country. But in Quebec's frame of reference, which if you've watched my video, What is Conservatism, is a very important thing to understand, the Bloc is pretty centrist in the point of view of a Quebec, both culturally and, I would say, religiously, but Quebec, it's not so much religion per se, but the laicity, the state secularism stuff. But we'll get into that in other videos when I do about some more Quebec stuff later. Just remember, in Quebec terms, the Bloc is pretty centrist. In the rest of Canada, it looks sort of left-wing, but it's slightly different because you're using different grading scales. You should not grade left, right the same in every area, especially because conservatism, as what is conservatism, my video on it, it's relative to the culture, religion, etc. of that group. So we have two parties that are, let's say, left wing, don't like the budget for various reasons, namely corporate welfare reasons, to concerns about how the spending is done. Not that there's too much spending, but just what is being spent on, if that makes sense. It's a disagreement on what the scope in which things are prioritized. Climate is a big one for the Greens, obviously. And the Conservatives oppose the budget because they don't think that the capital gains tax is a good idea for productivity reasons, and they don't like spending. Big surprise, right? Too much spending. The NDP also claimed to dislike the budget and then voted for it anyways because Singh is just that kind of guy who will say this budget is terrible. He unironically put an ad out, post on Twitter, saying that the budget is a $60 million conservative corporate welfare bailout, and then he voted for it. He attacked Poilievre for a budget that Poilievre did not vote for, and that he voted for. Pardon? What is he doing? But this is not a video about Singh, because that would be a boring video, because Singh doesn't know what he's doing. No. Instead, we're going to focus mostly on what this actually means going forward. So, the Liberals and the NDP obviously took a hit here, because those are the two parties who actually support the budget. They're the two parties who are actually running the government de facto, because everyone else usually opposes them on confidence issues, or at least the ones that matter. Okay. And this budget was a disaster. It's objectively true. There's no frame of reference here that this is good. Let's just look at it region by region. The territories, they lost. The Conservatives gained ground. Liberals and NDP lost ground. BC, same story. They gained nearly 2 points in BC. Alberta, same story. Somehow the Conservatives gained even more ground in Alberta. Some polls, the Ledger poll, has them at 71% with PPC. Like, that's ridiculous. It's not unprecedented. Scheer got 69% back in 2019, but still, that's a ridiculously high number of support in Alberta. Then we have Saskatchewan, Manitoba, same thing. Ontario. Even in Quebec, the Liberals and the NDP lost ground and the Conservatives gained ground. And obviously Atlantic Canada, the same thing happens again, because Atlantic Canada is tracking right very quickly. And then seat-wise, this also doesn't go well. The Liberals lost a seat in New Brunswick. They lost 7 in Ontario. The NDP lost a seat. Unfortunately for the Greens, they lost both their seats in just collateral damage moment. Poor Greens. They didn't deserve it. At least politically speaking. Whether you like the Greens or not, it's a whole other story altogether, but they're getting destroyed for reasons that are not their own doing. The Conservatives gaining ground. 9 seats in Ontario. 6 seats in BC. The Liberals lost 4 and the NDP lost 1 in BC. Like, it's just across the board terrible. We're talking about a 16-seat gain in just 2 weeks from a situation that was flatlined prior to this. This is the map we're looking at now. We can even zoom in. We have the technology. Look at this. Zoom in, enhance. Zoom in, enhance. Right? Boom. Powerful stuff right there. The Conservatives are breaking into Toronto. They're winning Spadina, Fort York here. Like, what? They're bringing a bunch of stuff in Mississauga. They're winning in Central York area. I think that's the area. Anyways. And then you look in Vancouver area over here. Like, what? If you showed someone this kind of stuff way back when, way back in 2021, people would not believe this kind of performance for the Conservatives. People would be like, you are wish casting to the nth degree to have Conservative performance this strong in the country. There's no way the Conservatives are going to get more than 200 seats. There's no way they'll have more than 40% of the popular vote. They've never scored that high before. And those people in 2021 would be perfectly reasonable and perfectly rational to say those things. This scenario right now seems entirely unprecedented. It's almost hard to believe. And in fact, I would say the Liberals themselves aren't really believing it. They're in shock. That's why they seem so incapable of handling this, because they don't understand what's happening. They can't rationalize how their worldview, not their ideology, but the liberal view that they are the natural governing party, is just collapsing right now. If that is true, if they are the natural governing party, there should not be scenarios where the Conservatives seemingly inexorably gain ground every time the Liberals do anything. The only winning play at this moment for the Liberals is to basically just do nothing. And that's not because doing nothing will solve the problems that are stinging them. It's that every time they try to do something, using their own internal logic and their own ideology from their own axioms, it just makes the problem worse. The gist is, 60% of Canadians, according to this Ledger poll, want spending cuts. Think about that for a second. 60% want spending cuts. That means every time the Liberals run an ad, every time they say something that the Conservatives are going to cut spending, they are actively campaigning for the Conservatives because people want that now. This is a whole new world we're in, where austerity is publicly popular. That's not something I would have ever thought would be a thing I could say. But that's the world we're in now. And it seems inexorably, on every single issue, the Conservatives are winning at this stage. Pick the carbon tax. It's the cliche one now, because Poilievre's made it the center of his whole campaign, his whole pitch. But a recent poll had 55% of Canadians oppose the carbon tax, and only 32% support it. Back in 2021, when Erin O'Toole famously flip-flopped on the carbon tax, it was roughly 60% supported it and roughly 40% opposed, once you moved undecideds. This is a colossal change. Then you look at things like immigration, and we're seeing very similar numbers. We're seeing something like 60% of Canadians want to reduce immigration. Again, 3 or 4 years ago, that was very different. It was a different ballgame. They actually kind of supported more immigration. And you can keep picking more and more issues. Basically, every single possible issue the country has slid to the right on. And that seems a little shocking. And a lot of people are kind of in disbelief about this. Why would this be happening? What's going on? Why is there this seeming movement? And then there's the other consideration that people have is, okay, is Poilievre the one doing this? Is it just the culture changing? What's going on? And these are very deep and important questions that I think a lot of people don't properly want to comprehend. And I think that's why Singh and Trudeau are doing such a bad job politically right now, because they don't want to acknowledge that the circumstances they're campaigning in are not the campaigning circumstances of 2015. The country is changing. Now, it's been changing the entire time. It never stops changing. But right now, we're finally starting to see these changes go somewhere. I have a political theory that I've been running for a while, and eventually I will one day post a properly detailed video about it. My understanding of politics here is building towards that. I just want to try to put ground layers down so people can really understand what I mean when I talk about things. The gist here is that the society is cyclical in a sense that what happens runs in patterns based on generation cycles and how different generations react to each other. Yes. Basic stuff, right? At least I hope it is. When I do the video, it'll be basic stuff then. But the gist and important part here is what the new cycle wants is a reaction to what the old cycle lacked. Because the important thing here, what you always need to remember with politics, no matter what color you support, no ideology, no worldview, no man can solve every problem in society. It's impossible. Human constructed ideologies, worldviews, beliefs cannot answer questions caused by man. You can't infer the solution to something from inside the system. You can make things better. There's definitely correct answers to problems, but one set cannot solve the problem. Picture, say, as an example, physics. You can't solve all of physics with just general relativity. You need other theories, such as quantum dynamics. So what does that mean here? Well, in Canada, we've operated under what I would call liberalism for basically the last 90-ish years, since about the Great Depression, when the Liberal Party first became ascendant, because the important thing that people neglect when they say the Liberals are the natural governing party is that's only a phenomenon since about 1935. Prior to that, the Conservatives won more elections than the Liberals did. So since about 1935, the Liberals have won most elections. And when the Conservatives have won elections, they're more of a liberal conservative, possibly even just a liberal itself. Brian Mulroney, in everything his government did, is not usually or very meaningfully considered conservative. Free trade, tax reforms, immigration reforms, etc., those are liberalization moments. They're not a conservative thing inexorably or innately. Now, some conservative philosophies can have liberal economics, but those are different. Watch my videos on the two subjects if you want to know more. So, generally speaking, the country has been run by a liberal worldview for the last 90 years. And what we're seeing now is that the liberal worldview is incapable of answering and solving questions and problems that we have today. Now, you could be easily confused and think these problems are things like inflation or things like the housing crisis or whatever, but those aren't actually the problems. Those are the symptoms of the problems. More easily seen and more easily understood is to look at the basic underlying social dynamics, and that will tell you everything you need to know. And what are these social dynamics? Well, there's a couple of things clearly showing that the West in general, because this is mostly true for the West, but we're going to neglect other countries because of time. But there is an underlying, obvious physical manifestation of going on things in the West. Things like fertility rate is continually declining, and fertility rate's a very important statistic because people having kids is fundamental to society. There's no kids, there is no society. That should be obvious, right? Yes. But then the other big thing is the dysfunction between genders among the youth, social isolation, lack of friends, growing mental illness, etc. Those are the real problems. And those are the real things that are causing society to change. And this change, I can't tell you what it's going to pick because my theories do not forecast how people will react to stimuli. Just that if there is a problem that a worldview cannot solve, they're going to look for a different one. And liberalism can't solve these problems because they are problems of liberalism itself. Why are they problems of liberalism itself? Well, namely, pick, say, children or social isolation. Those are two related problems because social isolation begets lack of children because people don't get married. Yes? Okay. Those problems can't be solved by liberalism because in a liberal worldview, choosing not to have kids is an equally valid choice. And no liberal would be consistent to say otherwise. So to a liberal, there's nothing wrong with what has happened with fertility. There's nothing wrong with what's happened with people not getting married. Those are people's choices, therefore it's fine. Now, some liberals will recognize that this is bad because they're not stupid, obviously. They realize that people not having kids or not getting married is not a desirable outcome. But liberalism itself can't solve it. Now, a lot of honest people who self-identify as liberals might realize that this is a problem and realize they need to solve it and will start looking for non-liberal solutions either intrinsically or without realizing it. And that's perfectly normal. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just how life is. To wed yourself to one viewpoint system for your entire life when there's things that are telling you it doesn't solve this problem is wrong. You shouldn't do that. And as I said earlier, not every system can solve every problem. That's just how life is. That's one of the reasons why democracy works. So what does this have to do with the budget? What does this have to do with the politics in Canada? This seems really abstract, yeah? Okay. Well, the society is pushing away from the Liberal Party's brand of liberalism. People don't like the social isolation and alienation that's growing up. They want something different. Now, is Poilievre that thing? Is his version of conservatism the anecdote to that? We don't know. It's too early to tell, but they are searching for it. And that's one of the reasons why everything the liberals do is hurting them. Because they're doubling down on things like spending, tax changes, basic root economic things that aren't solving the problem anyways, but also are ignoring the real problem. Just take a really big one that's blown up in the last few days, which is drug policy. The liberals' policy towards drugs, that of safe supply, safe injection sites, etc., just looks to the average person today as more of the same old, tired, liberal social policy. Policy that breaks down communities, isolates people, and leaves them alone. And that's exactly what safe supply and safe injection sites are. They are isolating circumstances. Because the underlying premise of both of those ideas is that only the addict's actions and choices matter. If they choose to keep doing drugs, that is their choice. We should just try to stop it from killing them or minimize their chance of dying. That is the internal rationality of that. And technically speaking, it is logically consistent in that system. That's why left-wingers who support this are really befuddled by the opposition to it. Because to them, it logically makes sense. And in their axioms, it does logically make sense. But to the rest of society, which sees the side effects of all of this, sees the people dying of drug overdoses on the streets, because no matter how much safe supply you use, you can't avoid the fact that opioids cause death. That is the expected outcome of opioid abuse, regardless of fentanyl overdoses by accident. So these policies the liberals are implementing are just the same policies that people have seen the last 10, 20, 30 years. They're different formats, they're in different areas, they're in different realms, but it's the same ideas and motivations. And the last 30 years in Canada haven't been great. Let's be real here. Really, we could even say the last 40 years haven't been great. We had a massive recession in the 90s. We've had another massive recession in the 2000s. Now, that one wasn't our fault, sure, but it still was a massive recession. We had COVID in the 2020. In there, we've had an unprecedented housing crisis. Our wages have stagnated, and by the time they were finally growing again, they've crashed again, and now our real GDP per capita is declining from 2000. We're back to, I think, 2014 levels. Well, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments on that one. So a lot of these basic core economic areas are failing. The social areas are failing. People aren't getting married. People aren't having kids. We have record overdose deaths on the streets. We have the highest murder rate in 30 years. Other crimes are growing out of control across the country. Now, sure, you could argue, in the grand scheme of things, crime in Canada is quite low, and you're correct, but it's higher than it was 10 years ago. That's not a trend people like to see. And in fact, actually, people generally don't like losing things they've gained more than gaining things that they don't have. In other words, if you take someone's car, they'll be more mad at you than they'll be happy by you giving them a car. And in fact, that psychological based thing I just described there is why most people aren't gamblers. People who are problem gamblers because they value gaining more than losing. Most people are the opposite. They are more opposed to losing things than they are to gaining things, if that makes sense. So what does this come down to? Well, people aren't satisfied with the status quo. It just doesn't seem to be working in any field whatsoever. There's really no economic gains that we have seen concrete in the last 30 years. And that's including the Harper government, by the way. Like, it wasn't as bad, you could say, in the Harper government, but it still wasn't great. Harper was probably a right liberal in governing policy. He was still under the liberal framework. It wasn't a different framework that was being used, for the most part. Now, this is not to say Harper and Trudeau or Harper and Chrétien are the same people, but it's the same underlying axioms of the government, which is the important thing here. How people act and what people believe are not necessarily the same things. But comment below if you want more on that. I might do that. I always say that, but we'll see. My time schedule is tight, so it's hard to fit these things in, but we're working on it. So people have been seeing the same policies not work very well. And then we're seeing it get worse and worse, especially if you start looking at very young voters like Gen Z era, etc. They're the most affected by this. That's why you see Gen Z have unprecedented mental health issues. That's why you see them actually being a very polarized demographic. Men in Gen Z are quite conservative for their age, and women are quite liberal for their age. And I don't mean liberal in the capital L sense. We're talking about ideological speaking here. And that's another reason why you see the last 30 years of politics be quite wild. It's been a wild ride in Canada, and that's not unexpected. That makes sense. Because if everything in the country is just not working properly, The economy is going poorly, social conditions are deteriorating. Yes, you can say some things like material abundance of technology and stuff has gotten better, but that's not something that Canada has done. That is just something we are benefiting from other countries doing, which is a different thing. Canada's own situation is not getting better, we're just benefiting off of the US effectively getting better. But again, back to the main point. In the 90s, we saw the PC Party, one of the two main parties of Canada, implode, turn into three parties, a separatist party, a generic PC Party, if you want to call that, and the Reform Party. Then we saw 12 years where the Liberals dominated because the opposition was completely split and there was no real opposition, effectively, as a result. And then we saw the Harper government, which was mostly minorities, except that one time they had a majority, and they did some things, but the most of it was addressing the recession that just happened, which I think you're reasonable to say they did an okay job. I think they probably were we had one of the better recoveries than the rest of the world in the recession, so not bad. Not bad. And we had the Trudeau government, first majority. One of the reasons why that was a big shock, a big win, not a big shock, is the Liberals tried to promise something different. People almost had something different. They didn't, though. And now we've had two Liberal minorities, that have been propped up by the NDP. And then the NDP story is also quite interesting. In 1993, the party was almost wiped out, down to 9 seats. And then they slowly rebuilt over 97, 2000, 2004. 2006, they started doing quite well. 2008, they did very well. 2011, they were in second place. 2015 was a little bit of a mean regression. A good performance of the NDP, but not terrible. 19 was a disaster. And 21 was a flop. And now they're looking at getting 13 seats. Depending on some projections that my own model does, if I really camp up the recency bias, they could get to 7. Will they get to 7? Who's to say? But it is a possibility. And if we look at the map, it's pretty obvious why this is a possibility. Windsor West, that's not very safe. Elmwood Transcona, not safe at all. Sing Seat, not safe. Nunavut, competitive. So that's 4 right there that are competitive, putting them to 9. Not great numbers. Not great numbers. So we have a lot of political chaos going on right now. In a way, people have really missed this. People kind of assume that this is just what's going on. This is just normal. No. This really shows us that voters in Canada want something new, want something different. They don't like the status quo. They don't really know what they want, but they know what they don't want. And that's why Poilievre, right now, is doing so good. He's offering something categorically different than Trudeau. This isn't the O'Toole playbook. This isn't the Harper incrementalist playbook that's mostly liberal but a little different. This is a categorically different philosophy. Is Poilievre an arch-conservative? No, not at all. I'd say he's probably a liberal conservative. Watch my video about conservatism if you want to know what that means. But it's clear he's operating under different axioms. He has different thoughts, different beliefs. And his Conservative Party in the policy under it is categorically different than in the past. This is why every time Trudeau does anything, it hurts him. Because people are reminded that Poilievre is categorically different to what we've had for the last 30 years, and Trudeau is the same. The last 30 years has been terrible, economically speaking, socially speaking. It's a lost quarter century, you could say, for Canada. So what is this all to say? Is Poilievre fated to win? Is Trudeau doomed? No. I would not be that bold yet, because things can change. Maybe Poilievre will flop once he has government. Who knows? But what is to say is voters want something different. And as soon as they have the different thing and it scratches the itch, that person or that party will be dominant. Will it be the Conservatives? No idea. What I can say is that as long as the Liberals keep being the same party they've been for the last 30 years, and you could even say, some people have said, that they're different, Trudeau versus Chrétien. They're not. That's why Chrétien still supports Trudeau. There's a difference. I could get more into that in a future video if you want, but at the end of the day, if the Liberals are the same party they've been since at least the last 30 years, you could even say since Pearson, maybe even King, they're going to keep failing because people don't want that. They want something new. May 2nd, you had a sneak preview of that, where the OLP flopped Milton by-election and Doug Ford was ascendant. That's not because, in my opinion, Ford is popular. It's because the OLP represents the same tired, old way of doing politics, and voters don't want that. They also don't like Ford, but he's already in power, so whatever. That's what voters think. And they will keep thinking that until somebody gives them something different. And that's true in federal, that's true in BC, that's true in every province in Canada right now. People want something different. But with that, I bid you adieu, and I will see you next week with something different.